Victoria!
Yes, Eleanor, what's happening?
If something happens to me...
Eleanor, you're scaring me.
Promise me you won't let him control the story. I don't think Richard wants me talking to anyone anymore.
Then leave tonight. I'll come get you right now.
Who are you talking to?
I have to go.
Victoria, these past 2 years, you've been the only person who made life feel normal again.
You've been through so much, Richard.
I don't want to lose another person I care about.
You won't.
I love you, Victoria.
And I'll always stay close to you. Close enough to destroy you.
Most people attending Eleanor Whitmore's funeral believed they were witnessing the tragic ending of a beautiful love story. The chapel overflowed with expensive white flowers, politicians, executives, television reporters, and grieving relatives dressed in black designer clothing. At the center of it all stood Richard Whitmore, billionaire founder of Whitmore Holdings, with his head lowered beside his wife's casket as mourners approached him one after another offering sympathy. He accepted every handshake calmly. His voice remained measured, respectful, controlled. To everyone watching, Richard looked exactly like the kind of husband newspapers would later describe as devastated by unimaginable loss. But one person inside the chapel noticed something deeply unsettling that day. Victoria Hale, Eleanor's best friend. Victoria could not stop watching Richard's face whenever he thought nobody was paying attention. And during those brief unguarded moments, she noticed something she would never forget for the rest of her life. Relief. Not grief. Relief. It appeared only for seconds before disappearing behind carefully rehearsed sadness. But once Victoria saw it, she could no longer unsee it. And as she stood there staring at the man Eleanor had spent decades loving, supporting, and defending, a quiet suspicion began forming inside her mind. What if Eleanor Whitmore had not simply died from stress and illness the way everyone claimed? What if something much darker had been happening behind the closed doors of the Whitmore estate for years? That question remained buried quietly inside Victoria's mind throughout the funeral reception. But before the evening ended, another disturbing detail made the feeling even worse. Richard was not behaving like a man whose world had collapsed. He was behaving like a man carefully protecting something. Before we go further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We always love hearing from you. And if you're new here, consider subscribing so you never miss stories like this. Because the deeper Victoria eventually moved into Richard Whitmore's world, the more she uncovered evidence that Eleanor's death was only one piece of something much larger, a carefully controlled system built on manipulation, fear, silence, and power. And the most terrifying part of all was this. Richard Whitmore had spent decades convincing everyone around him that he was a self-made man who protected the people he loved. But according to the secrets Victoria was beginning to uncover, the people closest to Richard were often the ones who suffered most. Long before Whitmore Holdings became one of the most powerful real estate corporations in the country, Eleanor Whitmore and Victoria Hale were simply two inseparable girls growing up outside Columbus, Ohio. Eleanor was warm, patient, and trusting. Victoria was sharper, more observant, more cautious about people. Somehow their differences made the friendship stronger instead of weaker. Eleanor softened Victoria's guarded personality, while Victoria protected Eleanor from situations her trusting nature sometimes failed to recognize. By high school, people joked they behaved more like sisters than friends. Then Richard Whitmore entered Eleanor's life during college. At the time, Richard looked nothing like the billionaire businessman the public would later admire. He was ambitious but financially unstable, jumping between temporary sales jobs while constantly talking about massive business plans nobody fully understood. What drew Eleanor toward him was confidence. Richard carried himself like a man completely convinced he would someday become important. Victoria's first impression was very different. She noticed immediately how carefully Richard adjusted his personality depending on who he was speaking to. Around wealthy people he sounded polished. Around professors he sounded intellectual. Around Eleanor he sounded vulnerable and sincere. Something about the performance behind his charm unsettled her from the beginning. But Eleanor dismissed those concerns quickly. And to be fair, Richard worked hard during those early years. He studied markets obsessively, networked aggressively, and chased opportunities other people ignored. What many people never knew was how much of his survival depended entirely on Eleanor. When Richard's first business venture collapsed under debt, Eleanor quietly helped cover expenses using money inherited from her grandmother. She introduced him to professional contacts through her own social network. During the years Whitmore Holdings existed only as a tiny office with uncertain contracts, Eleanor handled accounting work, scheduling, and client communication without asking for public recognition. Richard often claimed he built the company from nothing through determination alone. Technically, the story sounded inspiring. But privately, Eleanor had been carrying enormous portions of the weight almost every step of the way. Victoria watched all of this happen slowly over time. And although she admired Richard's ambition, she also noticed a dangerous imbalance forming inside the marriage. The larger Richard's success became, the smaller Eleanor seemed to make herself in order to support him. She stopped painting, which she once loved deeply. Stopped discussing her own dreams. Stopped spending time with friends regularly because Richard's schedule always came first. By the time Whitmore Holdings expanded nationally, Richard had become almost unrecognizable from the struggling young entrepreneur Eleanor originally married. Wealth transformed him. The confidence Eleanor once admired evolved into something colder. More controlling. At public events, Richard still appeared charming and charismatic. But privately, Victoria began noticing subtle moments revealing another side underneath the image. Richard corrected Eleanor publicly over insignificant details. Interrupted her mid-sentence. Dismissed her opinions while pretending to joke. None of the moments seemed severe individually. But together they created a pattern Victoria could not ignore. Eleanor noticed it too, although she rarely admitted it directly. Instead, she defended him constantly. Richard was stressed. Richard carried pressure nobody understood. Richard didn't mean things the way they sounded. Yet despite all the explanations, Eleanor slowly became quieter over the years. More anxious. More careful. Victoria remembered one dinner party where Eleanor accidentally spilled wine across a tablecloth. The mistake was harmless. Barely noticeable. But Richard's expression changed instantly. The smile disappeared from his eyes before returning seconds later once he realized guests were watching. Nobody else seemed to notice. But Eleanor noticed. Her hands shook for the rest of the evening. As the years passed, the emotional distance inside their marriage deepened quietly behind closed doors while the public continued admiring them as a powerful success story. Magazine interviews described Eleanor as the supportive wife behind Whitmore Holdings. Photographs showed luxury vacations and smiling public appearances. But privately, Victoria began receiving increasingly troubling late-night phone calls. Eleanor rarely complained directly about Richard. Instead, she described feelings. Exhaustion. Confusion. Loneliness. She spoke about walking carefully around his moods inside the house. About how one disagreement could transform an entire week into cold silence. Sometimes Richard ignored her for days until she apologized simply to restore peace. Other times he became intensely affectionate without warning, leaving Eleanor emotionally disoriented. Victoria recognized the pattern immediately. Richard was controlling the emotional environment of the marriage itself. And the most dangerous part was that Eleanor no longer trusted her own instincts consistently. Then came the first moment Victoria genuinely feared something serious might happen. Eleanor called her shortly after midnight one winter evening sounding unusually panicked. She said she had tried discussing separation privately with Richard after another argument involving company finances. According to Eleanor, Richard remained completely calm during the conversation. Too calm. He didn't threaten her openly. Instead, he quietly explained how destructive divorce could become for people connected to powerful companies. He mentioned reputations, financial instability, media attention. The conversation disturbed Eleanor deeply because Richard never directly threatened her, yet somehow managed to make her feel trapped all the same. Victoria urged Eleanor to stay with her temporarily. But by morning, Eleanor had changed her mind completely. She insisted everything was fine. It became a pattern Victoria would witness repeatedly over the following years. Moments where Eleanor appeared ready to acknowledge the truth about her marriage. Followed by sudden emotional withdrawal after private conversations with Richard nobody else witnessed. Meanwhile, Eleanor's physical health deteriorated rapidly. She lost weight. Her energy declined. Medical explanations remained frustratingly vague. Stress complications. Anxiety. Medication adjustments. None of it fully explained how quickly Eleanor seemed to be fading emotionally and physically at the same time. Then Victoria discovered handwritten notes Eleanor had hidden inside books throughout the house. At first they appeared random. Medication schedules. Appointment reminders. Fragments of thoughts. But eventually Victoria noticed a pattern. Eleanor repeatedly documented moments where she felt unusually disoriented after taking medication prepared by household staff. One sentence stopped Victoria cold entirely. "Sometimes I think he wants me too tired to think clearly." Victoria confronted Eleanor gently after finding the notes. But Eleanor immediately panicked and begged her not to mention them again. Even while denying her suspicions, Eleanor looked terrified. Then came the night Eleanor tried leaving for the final time. Victoria received a frantic phone call shortly after midnight. Eleanor sounded terrified. Not emotional. Terrified. She said Richard had discovered she met privately with an attorney regarding separation and asset protection. According to Eleanor, Richard remained unnervingly calm after confronting her. He spoke about financial investigations, media exposure, psychological evaluations. He reminded Eleanor that stress had already damaged her health severely and questioned whether courts would trust someone struggling emotionally. Victoria immediately drove toward the Whitmore estate intending to bring Eleanor away for the night. But before she arrived, Eleanor called again sounding completely different. Calm. Controlled. She apologized for overreacting and said everything was fine now. Victoria knew instantly Richard was nearby during the second call. And for the first time, she seriously considered contacting authorities despite lacking proof of any crime. Because deep down, she sensed something horrifying approaching. Eleanor Whitmore died on a rainy Thursday morning in late October. Publicly, the explanation arrived quickly. A severe cardiac episode connected to prolonged stress complications. By afternoon, every major business publication had already published sympathetic headlines. And at the center of every interview stood Richard Whitmore, composed and devastated in exactly the way people expected grief to look when filtered through wealth and status. Yet almost immediately, small details surrounding Eleanor's death began bothering Victoria. Eleanor had spoken to her less than 24 hours earlier. During that final call, Eleanor sounded exhausted but unusually determined about something she refused to explain fully over the phone. At one point she lowered her voice suddenly and whispered, "If something happens to me, promise me you won't let him control the story." It was the last time Victoria ever heard her friend's voice. The days following Eleanor's death unfolded with almost military precision. Richard controlled every detail personally. Medical staff refused outside questions. Eleanor's office was sealed temporarily to protect family privacy. Even close relatives complained quietly that access to Eleanor's belongings became strangely restricted. Victoria noticed something else too. Richard never appeared emotionally disoriented the way genuine grief often leaves people. Beneath the performance, there was structure. Calculation. It was as though he had already rehearsed surviving Eleanor's death long before it happened. Then came the detail that transformed suspicion into obsession. Roughly 6 weeks after the funeral, Victoria received an anonymous package containing partial estate surveillance footage recorded during Eleanor's final months alive. One recording captured Eleanor standing alone inside the kitchen late at night looking visibly weak and emotionally distressed. Several minutes later, Richard entered carrying medication and a glass of water. There was no violence. No physical confrontation. But the body language between them felt deeply wrong. Eleanor hesitated before taking the medication. Richard spoke to her quietly while standing unusually close. Eventually, Eleanor complied reluctantly while visibly shaking. The footage ended shortly afterward. Legally, it proved almost nothing. Emotionally, it changed everything. Authorities initially showed little interest in reopening questions surrounding Eleanor's death. Richard possessed enormous influence, powerful attorneys, and a spotless public reputation. Medical reports supported natural causes. Investigators viewed Victoria's concerns as speculative. Meanwhile, Richard began drawing Victoria closer after Eleanor's death. At first the conversation seemed innocent enough. Shared grief. Emotional support. But gradually, Richard's attention toward her became increasingly personal. Victoria recognized the manipulation immediately. Yet instead of distancing herself completely, she made a decision that would shock everyone who knew Eleanor. She decided to move closer to Richard instead of away from him. Less than 2 years later, Richard Whitmore married Victoria Hale. To outsiders, the relationship appeared controversial but believable. Two grieving people finding comfort in shared loss. But nobody understood the truth except Victoria herself. She had not married Richard Whitmore because she loved him. She had married him because she believed he destroyed her best friend. And she intended to prove it from inside his empire. Inside the Whitmore estate, Victoria slowly uncovered fragments of a hidden system Richard had spent years protecting. Confidential settlement agreements. Private medical consultations. Financial transfers routed through shell companies tied to healthcare providers. Even more disturbing were the behavioral patterns surrounding Richard. Former assistants signed aggressive confidentiality agreements. Several ex-employees refused speaking publicly despite generous financial offers. Fear still surrounded Richard years after Eleanor's death. Then Victoria uncovered the first undeniable crack in Richard's carefully constructed image. Archived insurance documents revealed Eleanor attempted changing certain beneficiary structures shortly before her death. The requests were blocked legally through emergency filings connected to Eleanor's declining mental condition. Victoria suddenly understood something horrifying. Richard had not merely isolated Eleanor emotionally. He had systematically built a legal and psychological framework capable of discrediting her completely if she ever tried exposing him publicly. The final revelation came during a winter trip to Aspen nearly 2 years into Victoria's marriage to Richard. After drinking heavily one night, Richard became unusually reflective while sitting beside the fire. At first he spoke generally about loyalty and betrayal. Then gradually, the conversation shifted toward Eleanor. Not with sadness. With irritation. Then Richard quietly said something Victoria would never forget. People think death is always violent. But sometimes all you have to do is stop protecting someone from themselves. Richard never explicitly confessed murder. But psychologically, the implication landed with devastating weight. Victoria immediately contacted retired forensic investigator Samuel Reed, who spent months reviewing records she secretly collected from Whitmore Holdings. What Samuel uncovered transformed the situation from emotional suspicion into potential criminal conspiracy. Hidden beneath shell corporations and private trusts existed financial relationships tied directly to physicians, psychiatric evaluators, and legal consultants connected to Richard for years. Eleanor had apparently discovered illegal financial diversions tied to executive accounts shortly before her death. And Richard likely realized she intended exposing everything. Then came the final blow. An elderly former assistant named Margaret Hale handed Victoria copies of private letters Eleanor secretly mailed weeks before her death. Inside one letter, Eleanor described feeling increasingly afraid that Richard was manipulating her medications through physicians connected financially to the company. She wrote, "I no longer trust being alone with him during severe anxiety episodes." 6 months later, the case exploded publicly. Samuel's findings leaked first. Then Eleanor's letters surfaced online. Former employees of Whitmore Holdings started speaking anonymously. Richard denied everything immediately, calling the allegations a coordinated attack. But during a civil deposition connected to financial fraud allegations, his composure finally cracked. At one point, Richard referred to Eleanor's suffering as manageable until she became resistant. The phrasing stunned investigators. Because it sounded less like a grieving husband and more like someone discussing operational inconvenience. And once the public heard it, the image Richard spent decades building began collapsing in real time. Criminal charges directly tied to Eleanor's death remained legally complicated. But federal prosecutors succeeded elsewhere. Financial conspiracy. Fraud. Witness intimidation. Coercive medical manipulation. One by one, executives who once protected Richard turned against him to avoid prison exposure themselves. The same loyalty Richard trusted for decades disappeared almost overnight the moment survival became personal. Victoria attended Richard's final sentencing quietly from the back of the courtroom. he looked older. Smaller somehow. Not physically broken. Emotionally stripped of the certainty that once protected him. For one brief moment before deputies escorted him away, Richard looked directly toward Victoria. There was no remorse in his expression. Only confusion. As though part of him genuinely could not understand why the world suddenly viewed him as cruel after spending decades rewarding his behavior with wealth, admiration, and power. And perhaps that became the real tragedy buried underneath Eleanor Whitmore's story. Not simply that one woman suffered behind closed doors, but that the system surrounding wealth, influence, and reputation allowed the suffering to remain invisible for so long. Because Eleanor was never weak. She was isolated. Carefully. Gradually. Quietly. The same way many people are long before anyone notices the damage being done. Years later, Victoria rarely gave interviews. But during one conversation, she said something that stayed with millions of viewers afterward. People always ask why she didn't leave sooner. But the better question is, how many warning signs do we ignore simply because someone looks successful from the outside? That question sparked thousands of conversations online. About emotional abuse. About coercive control. About how power often hides behind charm instead of rage. And even now, years later, people still debate Richard Whitmore's true guilt regarding Eleanor's death. Some believe he directly caused it. Others believe he simply created the conditions that slowly destroyed her over time. But maybe the most uncomfortable truth is this. Sometimes a person doesn't need to physically harm someone to ruin their life. Sometimes all they have to do is convince the world the victim cannot be trusted long enough for the damage to finish itself. And the frightening part? People like that rarely look dangerous when you first meet them. If this story moved you, shocked you, or made you think differently about the people we trust behind closed doors, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue bringing you deeply researched, emotionally powerful stories like this one every single week. And trust me, the next story we're working on is even more unbelievable.